Naoki Yoshida is an incredibly hardworking man, working on two mainline Final Fantasy titles simultaneously, those being Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XVI. It's an incredible undertaking for one person to carry so much of this franchise on his back. Recently, he sat down with Publication Inverse to discuss where he thinks the industry is headed, as well as what he describes as Final Fantasy's struggle to adapt. I'm glad he said it because I get beat up every time I try to. But if you do want to smack something, be sure to smack that subscribe button as we cover everything Final Fantasy and JRPGs on this channel. Here is what YoshiP has had to say on the matter. In terms of whether Final Fantasy is successfully adapting to industry trends, I believe the series is currently struggling. We're now at a point where we receive a wide variety of requests regarding the direction of our game design. To be honest, it'd be impossible to satisfy all those requests with a single title. My current impression is that all we can really do is create multiple games and continue creating the best we can at any given time. What? What do you mean you can't create a turn-based action Souls-like, Zelda-like, old-school Final Fantasy set in a medieval sci-fi, steampunk, futuristic medieval society that also happens to be a remake of Final Fantasy VIII? That being said, it is true, Final Fantasy is struggling to adapt to modern industry trends. Final Fantasy VII Remake, for example, was the first game to get combat right since I think Final Fantasy X, and managed to re-establish Final Fantasy as a game series with its own unique combat style. Though in other ways, you could say that its game design was lacking compared to some contemporaries, particularly in the case of its level design. It's clear when you look at the wide range of games that have come out over the past few years, Final Fantasy is struggling to figure out exactly what it is in the modern era. For many, this is all the more reason to default back to what Final Fantasy was classically: turn-based combat, airships, and an overworld map to explore. While indeed I personally miss many of these things, especially an overworld map and airships, both Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI have a huge task on their hand to successfully modernize these elements, as there is a strong sentiment within the fanbase that these elements have not been successfully modernized. But YoshiP notes that Final Fantasy should not be about chasing trends but setting them, and personally I could not agree more with that. My hope with Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is that from a game design perspective, Final Fantasy will have a strong sense of identity again, and even if it deviates on those elements across multiple games, as it certainly did back in its golden era, these titles were still all design-wise identifiably Final Fantasy. And for those who don't quite understand what I mean by this, if you look at Final Fantasy 1 through 10, there is some design coherence there. There are elements in which they innovate on, like the progression systems and different elements of combat. However, you can still tell they're all fundamentally within one continuity. The game's differences were more so in the junction system versus the materia system, and not so much in the fact that every single game had a different combat system, and them never reusing the same combat system or refining any of the elements of the previous game. And I would actually argue that because Final Fantasy never iterates on anything it does in the past anymore, like it used to with 1 through 10, this is a big reason why the series struggles from a game design perspective. Take elements from Final Fantasy VII Remakes and 16's combat system, and continue to build on those game systems in future entries, while continuing to put unique twist on them. I think it's very unrealistic for game series to take their game design and throw it out every single entry and completely start over. Final Fantasy did not used to do that, and even more honest than that, there is literally no game series I can think of that every single entry they throw out the core gameplay of the last one. But this is what Final Fantasy has become, and I think that by completely throwing out the core design philosophy of each previous title, you never have the opportunity to continue building a system to perfection, which is actually the strength of many long-running series. YoshiP also goes on to say, quote, "I am a game designer, so I always have several ideas for games. I can't talk about them here, but I think that goes for any game designer. I'm the kind of person who is happy as long as they can make games, so while there isn't anything in particular, I occasionally think I would like to make one more MMORPG title from scratch before I die." I think this is something that actually a lot of Final Fantasy XIV fans would love to see. Well, now Naoki Yoshida did have to rebuild Final Fantasy XIV, it's still not quite the same as him and his team building a brand new game from scratch. Getting people into Final Fantasy XIV can be a bit of a challenge, as A Realm Reborn is such a barrier that a lot of people don't see how great the later game is. If this team were to build a brand new MMORPG from scratch, I think it would be a huge success, particularly if it was an action MMO like something like Tower of Fantasy is. And using all the modern elements of technology today, this would be something that could definitely surpass FF14. However, considering that Final Fantasy XIV will not be slowing down anytime soon, and is likely to continue going for the decades to come, Final Fantasy XXIX Online is not coming anytime soon. Shout out to patron Pat Daddy and the rest of the Ultima community.